Today we are embarking on another historical journey that will take us more than 4 years to complete. We are excited and proud to share this journey with you. This is the story of the Eastern Front of World War II. As usual, we will approach it with the care to detail and figure that is essential in describing history, with new episodes released weekly, covering the events exactly 84 years after they happened. No story happens in a vacuum, and to tell you this story, we will need to frame it properly. Over the next 11 weeks, we will release episodes preluding the beginning of the hostilities on the Eastern Front. This first Prelude episode will talk about the Russian Revolution, the end of World War I, and the beginnings of the Russian Civil War. Our members and patrons have early access to the next 6 episodes. Become one by pressing the join button under the video or via the links in the description and pinned comment. The year is 1917. World War I has been raging since the summer of 1914. In the West, Germany has been stalemated in the mud since October of the first year. In the East, it is a different story. Under the Tsar, Russia struggles to hold the Central Powers back. In late 1915, the Tsar took personal command of the army, against the recommendation of his closest advisors. His tenure as Commander-in-Chief of the army has seen devastating defeats at the hands of the Central Powers. From the lakes of East Prussia to the foothills of the Carpathians, the Russian army has failed. Nothing close to a successful offensive has been achieved, much less a decisive victory. Indeed, the Central Powers have squeezed the Russian army to the brink of disaster. The front line had been pushed deep into Imperial territory. German soldiers were at the Gulf of Riga in the north. In the center, Pinsk had been occupied. In the south, the front followed the line of the Carpathians to the Black Sea. The war caused living standards to drop precipitously, and the unrest has been troubling the Tsar's government for months. In March of 1917, protests across the Russian Empire broke out. When combined with the brutal repression of the Tsar's government, war fatigue, and inattention to basic governance, these protests had all the ingredients required for an escalation. This wave of protest rapidly turned into full-blown revolution that moved faster than anyone predicted. In Petrograd, the socialist parties, led by the Bolsheviks, formed the Soviet, a council of leftist soldiers and workers. On March 13th, members of the Duma formed an interim government without the Tsar's permission. The Tsar abdicated on March 15th on behalf of himself and his son. Within days, the Tsar's brother also abdicated. Power was now in the hands of the Provisional government, which had successfully transferred control of the empire from the Tsars to themselves in a matter of days. Meanwhile, the Petrograd Soviet of Soldiers and Workers' Deputies positioned itself as a sort of unasked-for advisory committee to the new government. It was never legally a part of the Provisional government, but circumstances dictated the government to take the Soviet seriously. Tensions between the Provisional government and the Soviet ensured that the capital was never quite at peace. Petrograd was the scene of much informally sanctioned violence during the next few months, as the Soviet vied for influence within the Provisional government. The Provisional government wanted to rule Russia, fight its wars, and deal with its internal strife, but it remained to be seen how this unsteady foundation would be able to function. Russia's allies in the Entente were thrown off balance by the March 1917 revolution, though many of their diplomats and attachés had warned of its approach. Within days, they decided to fully support the Provisional government. The Allies were preparing for a series of offensives in the West. Towards the end of 1916, before the revolution, it had been agreed that the Russian army would support the spring campaigns by conducting an offensive of its own. Regardless of the revolution's change in leadership, the Russian army was not ready to go on the offensive again, as the losses of 1916 had been devastating. Men and materiel lost in huge numbers. Morale in the ranks was poor, and the leadership was confused following the change from the Tsars to the Provisional government. Loyalty among the senior officers was not guaranteed. Many of the troops looked not to their officers but to the Soviet. Soldiers' councils were formed in units across the front, and few showed interest in continuing the war. The Central Powers were generally aware of the leadership crisis in the Russian army. Sensing a chance for a favourable peace, local ceasefire agreements were negotiated with these councils, and without the Provisional government's blessing, primarily in the northern regions. Facing pressure from the rest of the Entente, the Provisional government decided that they had to go through with plans for the offensive. Action was needed to show the authority of the government and keep the faith of the Allies. The Soviet in Petrograd was anything but supportive and worked to undermine the plans of the government. In June of 1917, the army thought itself ready for a local offensive in the south, where the troops had been least infiltrated by the Soviet councils. Additionally, the troops there had the best leadership and equipment. The offensive would feature the 7th and 11th Armies, with the 8th Army in support. These armies would thrust across the front line, attacking the Austrian 2nd and 3rd Armies and the German-led South Army. The strategic picture was nearly hopeless from the beginning. No one expected meaningful changes, even from a successful Russian offensive. The best thing to be hoped for was that the Russians might continue to distract German leadership and keep reserves away from the critical Western Front. Some small success was gained at the beginning of the offensive, as the Russian armies faced a tired and bewildered Austro-Hungarian force dealing with its own issues of morale and material. However, the fundamental problems of the Russian army had not been addressed. When the Germans made their counterattack, the Russians could not hold them back. The attack petered out in July, having cost tens of thousands of casualties. The combined armies of the Central Powers managed to push the front line even deeper into Russian territory. For the German army in the east, everything was going according to plan. The Russian offensive had done little meaningful damage, and the counterstroke had been planned from the beginning. On July 19th, the last general offensive of the Eastern Front was unleashed. By September, Riga had fallen. Victory was near. The only thing left to do was decide what form the peace would take and how the spoils would be divided. Infighting in the highest circles of the German military-political establishment began over the soon-to-be carcass of the Russian Empire. Some of the leaders wanted a milder peace, with concessions and guaranteed economic support, while others wanted to annex large swaths of the European portion of the Russian Empire. Eventually, the greed of the maximalists won out. Russia would be effectively dismembered. By the fall of 1917, chaos reigned in Russian political circles. The Bolsheviks, in control of the Soviet, had decided to make their move. Led by Lenin, they seized the mechanisms of government in Petrograd. By year's end, Moscow, Sevastopol, Rostov, and dozens of other cities had fallen to the new Soviet government. The October Revolution had begun and ended in a matter of days. Within weeks, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was established. The first priority was to alleviate the domestic pressures facing the government. A flurry of reforms was passed immediately. Next, peace had to be secured. Negotiations began in December of 1917 in the German-occupied city of Brest-Litovsk, but stalled out until Trotsky declared to his fellow delegates that the war was over. Russia would not sign a treaty, but would also not fight. The army was ordered to be demobilized. The Germans were stunned by this development, but they resolved to push the front line as far as possible to force the Soviets to sign a treaty. The attack began almost immediately, and little to no resistance was encountered as they pushed forward. The rest of the Baltics fell quickly, and the Germans were not far from the capital. Fearing the destruction of their nascent state, the Soviets panicked and sent requests for terms. Still, the Germans pushed on, hoping to gain leverage for an even harsher treaty. Finally, on February 23, 1918, they sent terms. The Soviet government, realizing they had no choice, agreed immediately. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was devastating for the future USSR. The Russian Empire had lost vast swathes of land and people. The military was in shambles. None of the Allies recognized the Soviet government in Petrograd. Instead, they chose to continue to support the former Provisional government. The supporters of the Provisional government and old Tsarist regime, alongside other enemies of the Bolsheviks, had loosely organized themselves into what is known as the White Russians. The Soviet separate peace with the Germans increased the Allied support of the White forces. Seeing a failure of Russia's treaty obligations, the Allies determined to intervene in its internal affairs. By May, Allied forces had landed in Murmansk and Vladivostok. The US Army eventually sent several thousand troops to Arkhangelsk and Vladivostok. Initially, these troops were welcomed as security against further German intervention after the signing of the treaty. However, within months, fighting broke out between the Allied detachments and the newly created Red Army, and it continued for months. Meanwhile, the White forces were initially disorganized. local interests tended towards independence, and Allied support was never as strong as the White forces needed it to be. Eventually, several centers of resistance sprang up. General Anton Denikin became the commander of White Russian forces in the south. His base of support was centered around the Black and Caspian Seas. In the north, General Yevgeny Miller was in Arkhangelsk. Also in the north was General Nikolai Yudenich in Helsinki. Together, in 1919, these three would form the basis of support to give supreme command to Admiral Alexander Kolchak. This system of organized resistance acted as a shadow state until its virtual extinction in 1920, though fighting would continue until 1922. Fighting in the Russian Civil War had begun in the earliest days of the October Revolution and would not let up until victory was declared in 1922. For Germany, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty had proven to be a significant blunder. The occupied territories required over 1 million soldiers to remain stationed in the east. This significant garrison force prevented the troops from being deployed to the Western Front in their entirety, as had been planned. Food insecurity had plagued Germany and Austro-Hungary since the beginning of the war. It had been hoped that the gains in the east would alleviate this. These hopes were misplaced. No meaningful exports could happen overnight from a region so devastated by war and unrest. This failure meant that in 1918, the Central Powers saw increased unrest on their home front. No one denied that the war had to end soon. The question was, how can they end it in their favor? Desperate for an end to the war, Germany attempted a spring offensive. On March 21st of 1918, the Michael Offensive was launched. The German 17th, 2nd and 18th armies attacked on a line from the Somme to Flanders. The divisions in these armies had been specifically trained and selected for the assault. They attacked relatively unprepared British troops under the 3rd and 5th armies. The BEF had known the offensive was coming, but had not made adequate preparations. The German armies achieved strong progress in the first week, but it was only tactical in nature, even as they managed to push almost to Amiens. At this point in the war, nearly 10,000 American soldiers per day were arriving at the front. The German army could not match this. No matter how many British soldiers were put out of action, an American was ready to take his place. The assault continued to sputter into a second week. On April 5th, General Ludendorff called it off. The offensive had lasted a mere 15 days. More than 200,000 casualties had gained Germany nothing but 40 miles of territory. The BEF and the French army had suffered. However, they could find replacements much more quickly than the German army. The ready reserves of the British and French amounted to around 200,000 men. These numbers did not include the ever-growing American contingent. The Germans' replacements for the formations of the Michael Offensive numbered something closer to 60,000 men. The disparity in forces continued to balloon. Warnings abounded that the troops were near the end of their strength. Since March, the German army had suffered in the range of 1 million casualties on all fronts. Only 700,000 men had arrived as replacements. Still, Ludendorff was not so persuaded. He launched 4 more offensives that continued to drain the precious few reserves Germany possessed. Finally, in late July, the German army sputtered itself out. There was nothing left in the tank. The situation was dire. The balance of power on the Western Front had decisively tipped in favor of the Allies. Defeating Russia had not proven to be a salve for the problems in the West. German troops were displaying remarkable indiscipline. Division commanders complained to higher headquarters about the quality and fighting spirit of the troops. Looting by German soldiers became widespread. The peace movement at home had started to become hard to ignore. On August 8th, the Allies began the offensive that would end the war in the West. The 100 Days Offensive involved millions of frontline troops striking across the entire front. The American Expeditionary Force attacked across the line in the St. Mihiel sector. The BEF, the Belgians and the French struck in their respective sectors as well. The next few weeks were a demonstration of grinding attritional warfare. Casualties were some of the highest of the entire war. Ludendorff finally cracked under the pressure. His armies could not handle the Allies' offensive. In the middle of September, the Bulgarians collapsed, leaving the strategic southern flank of the Central Powers wide open. With this, the once unrelenting Ludendorff told the Kaiser that the war had to be ended. He even went so far as to suggest that the Social Democrats should be given power in the government. And so, Kaiser Wilhelm II appointed Prince Max von Baden to the chancellorship. Baden had been an opposition figure since the war broke out, but never expected to be handed the reins of power. On October 4th, he sent the first serious message asking for peace. These messages bluntly asked President Wilson for an armistice. Talks carried on through October. The German army was being ground to dust in Belgium, but Ludendorff now went to the Kaiser and asked for the war to be continued and Baden to be dismissed. He centered his opposition around lofty ideas of continued resistance if the armies could retreat to the German border in good order. The reality was that he had a physical and mental break in September when he had broached the idea of peace with the Kaiser. Now, a few weeks later, he managed to regain some measure of his strength and confidence. He used this moment to push back on the government. He was hoping to reassert his old authority and prestige with the Kaiser and have Baden tossed back into the street. Instead, Ludendorff was dismissed. His longtime ally, Hindenburg, was allowed to keep his position. The Kaiser had not yet managed to clear his cabinet of the war party. The Navy High Command attempted a last-ditch fight. On November 3rd, sailors mutinied when they were ordered to sea for a final battle with the Royal Navy. This turned into widespread disorder and protests in Kiel, then Lübeck. On the 10th of November, the Kaiser abdicated and went into exile to the neutral Netherlands. His abdication was moot. On the 9th, representatives of the Reichstag had declared Germany a republic. Representatives were sent to negotiate an armistice. A provisional government was formed. A peace treaty would come later. The war was over for Germany. Friedrich Ebert was declared the new leader of the government. He faced a growing crisis as communists and other far-left groups began to attempt to take power. The right-wing elements also did not disappear overnight. Fighting in the streets broke out across Germany. Blood was spilled as far-right and left movements attempted to solidify their influence. It was not until August of 1919 that a new constitution would be adopted. Stability began to return to Germany under the new Weimar Republic with this new constitution. It was designed as a compromise solution that allowed for a democratic process to resolve the differences between right and left. Neither side of the political spectrum would give up on violence as a means to achieve their ends just yet. Still, electioneering would come to be seen as the preferred method of gaining political control in Germany within a generation. The rest of Europe finally ended the First World War on November 11, 1918. The armistice was signed, effectively ending the war in the West, despite the fact that the Treaty of Versailles would not be signed until June of 1919. The war had been devastating to all involved. For the Central Powers, it was apocalyptic. The monarchs of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire were all overthrown. Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans ceased to exist altogether as states. Germany was severely diminished. Austria-Hungary lost something like 38% of all its soldiers as casualties and prisoners. The Ottoman Empire lost about 50% of its soldiers as casualties during the war. The Allies, as the victors, might have been expected to have come out stronger than they did, but the burden of the war was just too much for any state to carry without suffering severe damage. World War I drained the continent from London to Moscow of a generation of young men. Billions of dollars had been thrown into the war effort, and the best that could be said was that they hadn't lost. France was nominally the supreme land power in the world. No one could resist her armies in 1918, but it had taken nearly everything the country had to reach this point. France lost something like 70% of the men recruited during the war as casualties. Britain fared better, but only in relative terms. Close to 50% of recruits became casualties for the British Empire. The Russians suffered in the range of 35% of all soldiers as casualties. Millions more were captured or missing. Additionally, millions of civilians were caught in the crossfire, displaced from their homes, or starved to death. Europe was a vastly different place in 1918 than it had been in 1914. The most destructive war in human history had changed the geography, the demographics, and the politics of the continent. A power vacuum now existed in the Balkans, as all three major players had disintegrated. The Baltics too were radically different. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland and Finland had not existed in 1914. These countries mainly formed from the remnants of the Russian Empire, but Poland was also aggrandized after Germany's collapse. Ukraine now existed as an independent country for the first time since the 17th century. German military power had totally collapsed. In 1914, the Kaiser's army was widely respected. Many feared it as the most competent military force on the continent since Napoleon's day. Now it was restricted by a treaty to 100,000 men, with no tanks, no air force, and little hope of regaining its stature as the world's premier fighting force. The German navy was pathetically small. No submarines would be allowed. The surface fleet was limited to a tiny, obsolete force that could do little to influence naval matters anywhere in the world. The Russian army was in complete disarray in 1918. The German army might have been reduced to a tiny standing force, but they at least had managed to keep a strong core of experienced commissioned and non-commissioned officers in place. This was not true of the new Red Army. Officers were disappearing at alarming rates. Executions, dismissals and desertions were taking their toll. Ideological conformity was the primary factor in new assignments. Unsurprisingly, many aristocrats serving as generals found themselves unqualified on these grounds. A crisis of leadership developed. These hardships did not prevent the leaders of the new Russian Soviet government from attempting to reclaim the territories lost in the war. Versailles formalized the restored peace between the Central Powers and the Allies, but not in the entirety of Europe. Only 2 days after the initial armistice, Lenin's government had renounced Brest-Litovsk. Europe would know no peace. The Soviets aimed at reconquering their lost territories. The Russian Civil War had begun in the days immediately following the October Revolution, but simmered for months. Now that would change. Wars of reconquest flared up, and the Allies began to support the White Russians more fully. This week ends here with the end of World War I. Next week we'll track the development of the Red Army as it fought the Russian Civil War and tried to reassert its control over Eastern Europe. We also have a patron and member exclusive series on these events. You can join their ranks via the links in the description to watch it. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the prelude to the Eastern Front of World War II series. You won't want to miss it, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see the next video in the series. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.